Over the last 100 years, every major economic crisis has wiped out certain professions and made others indispensable. And every single time, it caught people off guard. Engineers, accountants, bankers who thought they were bulletproof ended up out on the street, while folks without a single diploma were putting food on the table and helping their neighbors get by. This isn't a story about education being worthless. Education changes lives, but there are skills that were around long before universities existed, and they keep on working long after economies fall apart. They made it through the Great Depression, hyperinflation, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Argentina's default, and a global pandemic. And not once did they lose their value. In this video, 4 of those skills. You'll probably guess 3 of them, but the 4th one is going to surprise you. Let's get into it. First skill, repair. The ability to fix what's broken. And here's why this works in any economy. When people have money, they buy new stuff. When the money's gone, they need somebody who can make the old stuff run a little longer. And the worse things get, the more they need that somebody. Argentina, December 2001. The country had just defaulted on $93 billion in sovereign debt, the largest default in history at the time. Banks were frozen, ATMs were bone dry, and the peso was about to lose its peg to the dollar and drop 60% overnight. Middle-class families were out in the streets banging pots and pans, the famous cacerolazos that became the symbol of that whole crisis. Unemployment shot up to 23%. 40,000 businesses shut their doors. But auto mechanics, electricians, and plumbers didn't just hold on. Demand for them actually went up. Argentines, who used to trade in their cars every 3 or 4 years now, needed those same cars to last another decade. A mechanic who could keep an old Renault running for another 100,000 kilometers wasn't just a repairman anymore. He was part of the survival infrastructure. And alongside all this, something remarkable popped up in Argentina. Barter networks called Truque. At their peak, 6 million people were involved. Folks were swapping services and goods directly. No money changing hands. And you know who was the most sought-after person in those networks? Not bankers, not lawyers. It was the guy who could fix a washing machine in exchange for half a dozen eggs, or patch up a roof for a bag of flour. That exact same principle played out in a completely different place, and a completely different time. Cuba, 1993. The Soviet Union had collapsed 2 years earlier, and Cuba lost 80% of its oil imports and 85% of its trade practically overnight. GDP contracted by 35%. The government couldn't import new equipment, and the old Soviet machinery had to keep running no matter what. A mechanic who could machine a replacement part out of scrap metal became more valuable to the economy than a credentialed economist. Now look at where things stand today. In America, the average age of a licensed electrician is 55. Young people are heading into offices, into tech, into marketing, while the skilled trades are graying out. At the same time, artificial intelligence is starting to eat into white-collar work. Copywriters, analysts, junior accountants, jobs that used to feel rock solid are suddenly on the chopping block. But AI can't show up at your house and fix the wiring, swap out a pipe under your sink, or pour a foundation. When does repair not work? When the skill is tied to one specific technology that dies off. The typesetter, the telegraph operator, the horse-drawn carriage driver, brilliant specialists, right up until the world moved on without them. The repair skills that survive are the ones tied to basic human needs. Pipes will always leak, walls will always crack, and machines will always break down. Those needs don't go obsolete, which means the skills that serve them don't either. Second skill, growing and preserving food. And I want to say this right up front. This isn't about quitting your job and becoming a farmer. This is about knowledge that practically every person on the planet had 2 generations ago, and that has almost completely disappeared. Moscow. Summer of 1992. The Soviet Union had been dead for 8 months. Store shelves were empty. Inflation was running at 2,600% a year. Pensions were evaporating into thin air. And yet, 71% of Russian families had a dacha, a small plot of land, usually outside the city. According to Russia's statistical service, those dacha gardens, sitting on roughly 3% of the country's farmable land, and were producing around 80% of its potatoes, about 80% of its berries and fruit, and 66% of its vegetables. Russia didn't experience a famine after the Soviet collapse, and the reason is almost entirely those dachas. But here's what matters, and it's the part most people miss entirely. It wasn't owning the land that saved people. It was the knowledge. Academics and city professionals who'd bought dachas as status symbols in the 80s but never actually learned to work the soil ended up in the exact same boat as their urban neighbors. The land was there. Seeds were available. But knowing when to plant, how to deal with pests when the chemicals had vanished from the shelves, how to can vegetables without giving everyone botulism, how to cold store root vegetables through a Russian winter. That was the real survival variable. Now think about today. 75% of the world's calories come from just 12 plants and 5 animal species. The supply chains that deliver those calories to city populations run through dozens of countries and thousands of logistics nodes. The disruptions of 2020 and 2021 showed how fast those chains can snap. The knowledge of how to produce, preserve, and distribute food locally, knowledge that was universal 2 generations ago, is quietly becoming one of the most undervalued skills on the planet. When doesn't this work? When the government confiscates your land. The Soviet Union, Zimbabwe, Cuba. That's real history. When the climate makes growing impossible. And of course, one backyard garden isn't going to feed a city. There are limits to the scale. But the basic knowledge of how to grow food and keep it from spoiling, that can't be confiscated, can't be inflated away by a printing press, and can't be replaced by an app on your phone. Third skill, medical knowledge. And I want to be real careful here because this one's easy to get wrong. This is not about saying medical degrees are worthless. A medical education is one of the most valuable things that exists. This is about something else. The difference between a credential and actual knowledge, and what happens when the institution that makes the credential work stops functioning. Cuba, 1993. That same special period. GDP had dropped 35%. Hospitals were left without anesthetics, without antibiotics, often without electricity. Cuban doctors, some of the best trained in all of Latin America, found themselves in a situation where they had the diploma, but not the tools. Nurses were reusing needles until they went dull. No medication, no antiseptics, next to nothing. Thousands of doctors did the math and got behind the wheel of a taxi, not because their knowledge had become useless, but because officially earning a living through medicine was nearly impossible. A doctor's salary ran about $30 to $50 a month, while a cab driver could pull in 10 to 20 times that on tourist tips alone. This isn't some tall tale. It's a well-documented phenomenon that's still going on in Cuba to this day. But here's the other side of that same story. The doctors who adapted, who started treating people informally, working with whatever they could get their hands on, improvising solutions out of nothing, became the most valued people in their neighborhoods. A former nurse who'd spent 25 years in government hospitals told reporters how they'd come up with what they called inventions, using a chair to prop up a patient's bed, cutting the tip off an IV line to rig up an oxygen feed. Improvisation at the absolute edge of what's possible. That same pattern shows up in every crisis zone. Post-war Europe, post-Soviet Russia, Venezuela, everywhere you look. People who understood basic biology, who could dress a wound, spot an infection, and deliver first aid were worth their weight in gold. Not because they had a piece of paper on the wall, but because they had knowledge that worked without a building around it. And here's what's worth thinking about today. Modern medicine is incredibly powerful. but it's incredibly dependent on infrastructure. Without a hospital, without equipment, without a drug supply chain, even the best surgeon in the world is limited. But basic medical knowledge, first aid, wound care, understanding infections, basic hygiene, that works anywhere, anytime, without a single piece of equipment. When doesn't this work? Major surgery without proper equipment just isn't possible. You can't replace antibiotics with herbal tea. Oncology, cardiac surgery, organ transplants, all of that requires institutions. There are real limits, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But the basic understanding of how the human body works and how to help it in a critical moment, that's a skill no crisis in history has ever made worthless. And the fourth skill, the one you probably didn't expect to see on this list, negotiation and trade, the ability to connect people, create an exchange, and put a deal together where no market exists. When an economy collapses and rolls back to barter, the most valuable person isn't necessarily the one who produces things. More often than not, it's the one who connects. The one who knows that this guy has flour but needs tools, and that guy has tools but needs medicine. And there's a third person willing to swap medicine for flour. The person who can hold that whole map of needs in their head and put together a chain of trades, that's not a middleman in the negative sense. That's the person who keeps the economy breathing when the money stops working. This principle was around long before any crisis. The Venetian merchants, they didn't have spices, they didn't have land, they didn't have armies, but they controlled the trade routes from Constantinople to Alexandria. And every ounce of pepper, cinnamon, and clove that reached Europe went through them. Their skill wasn't producing anything. It was standing between the producer and the buyer and being able to cut a deal with both. The middlemen on the Silk Road made more money than the people who actually produced the silk, not because they worked harder, but because they connected two worlds that couldn't have reached each other without them. Argentina, 2001. Those same Truk barter networks again. 6 million participants. And here's what the evidence showed. The most successful people in those networks weren't the ones making the best product. They were the ones who could organize the exchange, figure out who needed what, come up with an arrangement, and bring the right people together. They were the hubs of those networks, and a disproportionate number of deals flowed through them. Post-war Germany, the black markets, they ran not so much on goods as on people who knew where to find things and how to bring a buyer and a seller together. In bombed-out cities where the official economy had flatlined, those people were literally the bloodstream through which everything moved. Food, building materials, medicine, you name it. And now, today, artificial intelligence can write a report, crunch numbers, and analyze data all day long, but close a deal when both sides don't trust each other, read the person sitting across the table and figure out what they actually need, build the kind of relationship that lets you do business when nothing is certain. That's a skill no algorithm is touching because it runs on context, gut feeling, and trust. Things a machine doesn't produce. When doesn't this work? When the government actively cracks down on informal trade. The Roman Emperor Diocletian set a price ceiling back in 301 AD. The penalty for selling above the limit was death. North Korea today keeps a tight lid on any kind of private exchange. When being a go-between becomes a crime, the skill hits a wall. But those examples are rare in history, and the examples of this skill saving people number in the hundreds. 4 skills: repair, food, medicine, negotiation. What do they all have in common? All 4 work without institutions. A plumber doesn't need a stock exchange to fix a pipe. A backyard gardener doesn't need a supply chain to grow potatoes. A person with basic medical knowledge doesn't need a hospital to dress a wound. And a negotiator doesn't need a marketplace. They create one. This isn't an argument against education. Education opens doors, broadens the way you think, and gives you opportunities you wouldn't have had otherwise. But these 4 skills were working long before universities existed, and they'll keep working through any crisis because they're tied to needs that don't go away. You don't need to quit your career and become a plumber, but knowing how to fix things, how to grow food, how to handle a medical emergency, and how to negotiate a deal, that's not a doomsday plan. It's just common sense. Which of these 4 skills do you already have, and which one would you want to pick up first? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. I break down these patterns every week. Subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.